Welcome to Real Bear Reviews, your paradise for movie lovers. Thank you for supporting our channel. Your love keeps us alive and growing.
A deafening gunshot tears through the silence inside the luxurious apartment. The man's pained scream echoes, and a slow, unassuming assassin emerges from the shadows. The man, seemingly defeated, suddenly rises like a wild beast and quickly grabs the gun from the opponent's hand. He immediately turns and pulls the trigger, executing the assassin with a shot to the head. But just as he does, the situation changes. A woman with a seductive figure suddenly appears behind him. The two of them exchange a few swift moves before leaping out of the window together. Who are these two, and why did they appear at the scene of this bloody murder? And what dark secrets do they hide? No one knows. However, what's surprising is that the very next day, they meet again and talk like old friends, complaining about the trivial matters of daily life. It turns out they are a married couple. The husband, George, is a kind man with a slight obsession. The wife, Laura, has a lively and open personality and gets along well with everyone around her. The only thing is, the couple's identity is far from ordinary. They were once both legendary agents who, tired of the endless killing, decided to completely retire and escape their agent life. They went into hiding in a peaceful mountain resort, living an ordinary but precious life. The dark past of their spy career had become a memory they kept hidden in their hearts. But sometimes, fate is too unpredictable. A sudden accident, like a bomb from the sky, immediately shatters their peace. That morning, George was on a long hike with friends in a nearby forest. They were chatting casually, but suddenly, a deafening explosion went off, followed by a thick column of black smoke rising from deep within the forest. The friends ran to investigate and were horrified by the sight. A small plane had crashed into the forest, its body warped from the violent impact, with flickering flames all around. George immediately checked on the pilot but found that both had been shot and killed. Years of experience as an agent made him realize that the sniper was likely still hiding nearby, so he told the others to leave. He then took a pill from the pilot's body. However, George didn't know that their entire conversation had been transmitted by the plane's communication device to the ears of Richard, a CIA agent. Richard immediately guessed George's identity, and combined with his unusual appearance at the crime scene, Richard suspected that the former CIA agent had joined an international spy organization called the Wing. He contacted another former agent named Mike, hoping he could help resolve the matter. After careful consideration, Mike agreed to take on the mission. Meanwhile, George, having retrieved the pill, was getting ready to leave with his friends, but the next second, the sniper hiding in the bushes suddenly appeared. A convoy of cars then drove up, and a large, burly man named Olin, the leader of the armed group, stepped out. Olin asked George and his friends what they were doing there. When one of his friends answered in French, Olin immediately shot and killed him without a word. He then pointed the dark muzzle of his gun at George. However, George remained astonishingly calm. Olin stared at him for a moment and then lowered his gun. But as soon as Olin turned his back, George quickly snatched the gun from a subordinate's hand and began firing at the mercenaries. At the same time, Laura saw the smoke rising from the mountain, and she had a bad feeling. Sure enough, not long after, she heard intense gunfire from a distance. Laura knew something was wrong. She turned and sent a message, then quickly took her friend back home. Once there, she broke a mirror, gave her friend a sharp piece of glass for self-defense, and told her to stay in the room and not come out. Back with George, he was still fighting fiercely with the mercenaries. Outnumbered, he had to use the terrain and trees as cover, accurately eliminating the ones who were chasing him. This group of mercenaries was equipped with modern weapons and clearly well-trained. Facing a relentless wave of enemies, George dared not engage in direct combat, so he had to fight and retreat at the same time. He then stole an enemy military vehicle and sped away. But the mercenaries were not going to give up easily. A hail of bullets poured towards him. To make matters worse, the car suddenly malfunctioned at a critical moment, crashing into a tree and stalling. However, not all hope was lost. Seeing a motorcycle speeding towards him, George came up with a plan. He secretly hid behind the car, waited for the motorcycle to get close, and then suddenly lunged out, shot the driver, stole the bike, and escaped. Who are these people, and what is their connection to the plane crash? And what fate awaits George and Laura? Not long after, Olin and his men arrived at the small forest where George was hiding. He roared into the forest, demanding George surrender. When there was no response, he left a few men to continue the search while he and the rest headed to the resort, plotting to kidnap Laura. What does he want? Why is he so intent on killing George? Seeing Olin leave, George cautiously peeked out from behind a rock. He avoided the sniper's pursuit and sped towards the resort on the motorcycle. Meanwhile, Mike also began his mission as instructed by the CIA. Seeing the helicopters roaring overhead, George became even more worried. In another scene, Laura was deliberately disguising herself. She took off her wig and unnecessary jewelry, then changed into a black combat suit and a bulletproof vest. She then hid a pistol and a dagger on her waist, put on a black jacket, and left the house with a suitcase. In a clearing in the forest, she burned her suitcase and everything inside. She then returned to the neighborhood but found a black Jeep parked in front of her house. Next to it were two armed strangers. One of them was clearly a soldier. Laura watched them cautiously from a distance, then took out her communication device and sent a message. At this moment, Olin was asking the soldier to send more men. From their conversation, it was clear that these two were not on the same side. So what made these two different forces decide to cooperate? Back at the house, Laura immediately told her friend to hide under the bed. She then pulled the curtains and dimmed the table lamp. Not long after, a group of mercenaries came looking for Laura, undeterred by the rain. Laura, who had anticipated this, was hiding behind the wall with a gun. Seeing the enemy approaching, she decisively fired and killed the two in the front. The mercenaries behind them rushed forward to help, but Laura beat them all up. She finally took them out with a fatal dagger stab. At almost the same time, George escaped the pursuit and returned to the resort. However, he didn't rush home but instead cautiously observed his surroundings. He then broke into an empty house to rest for a while. Next, he called the CIA and asked Richard about the plane crash, but Richard said he knew nothing. With no other choice, George told Richard that Olin had also appeared at the plane crash scene, and he knew what Olin was there for, because he had just found a USB hidden in the pill. It was clear that Olin was there to get it, and George was sure that the CIA was also interested in this USB. So, he proposed a deal with Richard, using the USB to trade for his and Laura's freedom. Richard was clearly shocked by his decision, but before he could recover, George dropped another bombshell. It turned out he had known for a long time that Mike was at the resort, so he told Richard to have Mike come to see him. George then hung up and contacted Laura. At this moment, she was getting ready to go out to dispose of the bodies in the house. Knowing that George was safe, Laura breathed a sigh of relief. The two of them exchanged information and learned that Olin and Mike had both arrived at the resort. They were now faced with a headache, having to discuss their next course of action. Laura suggested they meet to talk in person, but George said he had something very important to do first. He then appeared at Mike's temporary hiding place. Seeing his former colleague in the house, Mike greeted him warmly, and then asked about the pill. However, George said he couldn't find it. Mike immediately understood. It seemed that even though Mike was hired by Richard, he supported George. Mike then explained that the pill contained some encrypted documents, but no one had been able to decode them yet, and he advised him not to waste too much effort on it. After saying that, Mike made an excuse to go to the bathroom, but just then, George suddenly stood up and took a test tube from the room, then pointed his gun at the bathroom. Mike walked out to find a dark gun muzzle pointed at him, and he was startled. But George didn't want to joke around anymore. He directly asked what these test tubes were for. Seeing George's serious face, Mike had to tell the truth. It turned out that the test tubes contained a new drug, and the pilots on the crashed plane were also guinea pigs for this drug. Just as they were talking, a screeching tire sound suddenly echoed from downstairs. A group of heavily armed mercenaries then surrounded the small house. A confrontation was inevitable. In contrast to a worried George, Mike, with his rich experience, was very calm. He picked up an AA-12 automatic shotgun, cocked it, and prepared for battle. At this moment, the mercenaries had also rushed upstairs. The outcome could be guessed by anyone. With just 2 shots, Mike eliminated all of them. In another scene, the CIA, realizing the great value of the USB, quickly formed a task force, determined to retrieve it at all costs. At the same time, Olin also desperately wanted to get the USB. Taking advantage of the CIA's focus on George, he assembled a small team to kidnap Laura, who was still at the resort. All eyes were on the retired couple. How would they get through this crisis? Under the cover of darkness, Laura took out a guard, then stealthily infiltrated a building. This was where the friend who went on a hike with George that morning was being held captive. Laura approached the guard inside quickly, then decisively killed him. However, the noise attracted the attention of the soldiers downstairs. They rushed upstairs to investigate, but as soon as they stepped onto the staircase, one of them was shot and fell. The others knew something was wrong. They cautiously entered the room with their guns ready, but before they could react, Laura suddenly appeared from behind and quickly took them all out. But just as Laura was about to dispose of the bodies, another team of soldiers arrived. Laura pretended to surrender. Then, while they were distracted, she immediately pulled out the dagger hidden in her jacket and launched a fierce attack. However, despite her excellent fighting skills, she was outnumbered. Laura was eventually restrained by a soldier and taken to be held with the other hostages. Back with George and Mike, they were still in a standoff with the mercenaries downstairs. The situation was at a stalemate. Just then, Olin received a report and arrived at the scene. He asked the mercenaries why they weren't attacking. The captain explained that the 2 people inside had modern weapons, so they didn't dare to make a move. Hearing this, Olin became furious. He had paid them to come here not to sightsee. He ordered the captain to take his men and stand at the building's entrance. The next second, a gunshot rang out. Seeing Olin's madness, the other mercenaries were terrified. This tactic of killing a chicken to scare the monkeys worked, and no one dared to defy Olin's orders anymore. At the same time, George, who was hiding inside, also saw the scene. He told Mike everything that had just happened, but for some reason, Mike seemed very strange. George rushed over to help him up, but to his surprise, as soon as he got close, Mike took the opportunity to inject him with the drug. George's eyes widened in disbelief. After all, Mike had promised to help him, so what was the meaning of this? Fortunately, the drug didn't have an immediate side effect, but Mike ignored his question. He then picked up a pistol and aimed at the power box on the street. The entire street was immediately plunged into darkness. As soon as the lights went out, the armed forces below immediately took up their positions, ready for battle. Olin looked up at the dark windows and ordered his men to attack immediately. Even if it meant flattening the building, George had to be captured tonight. He then fired a few flares into the building. An assault team immediately stormed in. However, these men clearly had no combat experience. As soon as they stepped onto the stairs, they were taken out by George and Mike hiding in the shadows. Next, the 2 of them fought like a whirlwind, quickly eliminating all the enemies hiding in the building. They then fired a barrage of bullets at the wall. The wall quickly gave way under the onslaught. Seeing this, George immediately lunged forward and broke through the wall. However, they still hadn't escaped the building. Mike then threw a grenade, and the wall outside was immediately blown open. But just as they were about to leave, Mike found the USB on the ground. Only then did he realize that George had found the pill earlier. Without a word, Mike punched George to the ground, took the USB, and left without looking back. At this moment, Laura was being interrogated by a soldier. The captain, Crow, couldn't hide his anger. Remembering his dead comrades, he didn't hesitate to punch Laura. Crow then searched her and found a satellite phone. Knowing this was the couple's private communication device, he forced Laura to send a distress signal to lure George to them. With no other choice, Laura had to enter a few lines of code into the device. Crow was about to look at the message when the phone suddenly exploded. Seeing his comrade shot and killed, Crow quickly tackled Laura to the ground. The two of them immediately wrestled with each other, their moves brutal and aimed at each other's vitals, clearly trying to kill each other. The air was filled with a sense of danger. After a fierce fight, both were exhausted, like arrows that had run out of power. Seeing the dagger stuck deep in her stomach, Laura endured the pain and picked up the gun from the ground. Crow also tried to raise his gun. However, the hand holding the gun slowly lowered. He clearly had no more strength to continue fighting. He tried to beg Laura for mercy, but as a professional agent, how could Laura let a tiger back into the mountains? She slowly walked over to Crow and then decisively ended his life. In another scene, George was still in the midst of a brutal battle. Faced with heavy gunfire, the pistol Mike gave him proved to be very useful. George shot down one enemy after another, using the wall as cover to fight. However, bullets would eventually run out. He had to leave his cover, pull out his pistol, and continue the attack, but just then, George was hit by a huge explosion and fell to the ground, unable to move. At this moment, Olin, who was hiding, finally appeared and asked him where the USB was. George didn't answer right away, but instead asked him what was inside, but Olin completely ignored him. Helpless, George had to tell him the truth, that the USB had been stolen by Mike. This greatly surprised Olin. He didn't expect Mike to be involved in this, but he quickly figured it out. It seemed that the US government was also eyeing the USB. Since the USB was gone, Olin didn't trouble George anymore. Instead, he invited him to cooperate to steal the USB back from Mike. At the same time, the CIA had also come up with a final plan. They decided to send a drone to target and kill George, Laura, and Olin, determined to eliminate everyone who knew about the USB's existence. Immediately after, Richard received a call from George. Knowing that the drone was ready, he no longer pretended. His voice was full of arrogance and contempt as he openly threatened to have George killed before dinner. Knowing that Richard wanted to kill them to silence them, Laura immediately toppled the desk in the room to create natural cover. She then piled up the dead bodies in the room and hid underneath, using the bodies as shields to withstand the attacks. Not long after, the CIA drone roared overhead. The thermal sensor quickly located the three of them. A storm of bombs and bullets poured down. After a fierce bombardment, the three of them miraculously survived. George and Olin managed to run into the building in time, avoiding the new wave of attacks. They then set fire to the debris inside to create a false fire to trick the drone's thermal sensor. This trick worked, but the other mercenaries on the ground accidentally became victims. As soon as they got out of the car, they were shot full of holes. At this moment, the two people inside were shooting at the drone. Since they were at a disadvantage, they were quickly injured. The fire behind them was also out of control. Staying inside was clearly not a good solution, so the two of them decisively ran out of the building and continued shooting at the drone in the sky. With a deafening explosion, the drone hovering overhead blew up into pieces. Just as George was breathing a sigh of relief, Olin suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at his head. It turned out he didn't actually want to cooperate but only wanted to use George's skills to escape the US government's pursuit. Now that the danger had passed, George was no longer of any use to him. However, just as Olin was about to pull the trigger, a gunshot rang out from behind. It was Laura, who had survived and came just in time to save George. But before they could catch their breath, another drone arrived. The house behind them was engulfed in flames, but luckily, the two of them managed to run out of the danger zone in time. The next morning, the two of them were getting ready to go home. However, when they arrived at the pier, they saw Mike waiting for them. George knew what to do and threw his gun down, preparing to say goodbye to Laura. But just then, Mike suddenly felt something wrong with his body. He stumbled towards George, only to find out that George had stolen the test tube from the table during their first meeting and then secretly put it in his glass of vodka and tricked him into drinking it to get the antidote. Mike had no choice but to do as George said and promised to help him get revenge. But just then, the roar of a helicopter came from the horizon. It turned out that the cleanup crew sent by Richard had arrived. The movie ends here. It tells the story of two agents who, after leaving their organization, were attacked by intelligence agencies at their remote hideout. After a fierce battle, they managed to retrieve a stolen hard drive. The plot is thrilling and engaging from the beginning, quickly immersing the audience in a tense atmosphere. The constant attacks and chases keep the audience on the edge of their seats. The pacing of the movie is well controlled, with both spectacular action scenes and relatively lighthearted dialogues and reflections, which makes the story more diverse and rich. The characters in the movie are well developed. Sylvester Stallone, with his iconic muscular hero image and excellent acting, successfully portrays an experienced, determined, and brave agent. When faced with many dangers and challenges, he always remains calm and confident, demonstrating his excellent leadership and combat skills. Clint Eastwood also gives an excellent performance as an agent. His character is young and dynamic, with great professional skills and courage, creating a contrast and complement to Stallone's character. The movie is not just an action movie but also contains deep themes and meanings. Through the story of the two agents, the movie explores themes of loyalty, betrayal, and trust in the complex world of intelligence. Everyone has their own interests and motives. Loyalty and betrayal are separated by a thin line. At the same time, the movie also shows the light and tenacious strength of humanity. Even when faced with countless difficulties and dangers, the main characters remain firm in their beliefs, fighting for justice and truth. The visual effects of the movie are very impressive. The action scenes and special effects are meticulously staged, giving the audience a strong visual experience. The settings, such as the small cabin, the forest, and the city streets, are created realistically, making the audience feel like they are living in the movie. The soundtrack and sound effects also contribute to the movie's appeal. The tense music combined with the intense fighting sounds further enhances the audience's emotions. This new action movie is definitely worth watching. For those who are interested, you can watch the original movie, Alarum. At the end, I still don't know what's inside the hard drive. The value of a movie lies in its reputation, while the value of a movie review lies in its feelings. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What did you think of this movie? Please comment below.